in case of an earthquake and the place starts shaking.
Drop, cover, and hold on.
Drop, cover, and hold on in case of an earthquake.
There's a few tips that can keep you from harm. In case of an earthquake, you gotta stay calm. Move away from doors, windows, and things that can fall. Try not to use steps or elevators at all.
Drop, protect your head on your face. Don't go running all over the place.
Cover,
under a bed or a table, against a wall that's firm and stable.
hold on.
You must hold on, don't panic, stay calm.
Don't move until the shaking stops.
Here it is.
Drop, cover, and hold on.
Drop, cover, and hold on in case of an earthquake.
Drop, cover, and hold on.
Learn how to protect yourself during an earthquake. Log on to weready.org. That's weready.org for more information.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you for joining us at another insightful and valuable Canto Conversation. I want to thank you for spending the time with us or selecting to spend the time with us today. We have a truly exciting conversation ahead. The topic for today's discussion is earthquake hazard and the Caribbean. I will be your moderator. My name is Kenisha Brown Plunkett, and I'm the Business Continuity and Crisis Manager at Flow Jamaica. I am also the chair for the Business Continuity Committee at CANTO. So looking forward to a great discussion. Today we will have Miss Karleen Black. And this is rescheduled from late last year, but I believe it's timely. Karleen Black is a scientific officer located here in Jamaica at the Earthquake Unit. She received her bachelor's in geology from the University of the West Indies. She also has a master's degree with specialty in seismology, and this she received from the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Japan. She consults regularly with various government and private institutions. She would have recently facilitated us here at Flow Jamaica for our earthquake simulation less than 2 weeks ago. She handles and helps the parish councils, schools, as well as media to help educate the Jamaican public about earthquake hazards and risks faced by Jamaicans, right? Now, earthquake has no season. It can happen at any time. Jamaica is actually on the fault line, and so are a lot of places within the Caribbean. Ms. Black, without delaying you any further, thank you so much for selecting to be with us today. I'm gonna hand the stage over to you.
Thank you, Kenisha. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I am not going to make this very technical because I want us to have a good discussion. So I will just highlight the dangers or the risks. And while I'm doing so, you can think about where you have your assets and whether they are actually properly protected. So just give me a moment to share my slide with you. Okay, here we go. Earthquake hazard and the Caribbean. Now, I'm sure many persons, they don't think much about earthquakes when they think of the Caribbean, whether you're from the region or not. But we're more than just a group of islands with pristine waters and lots of sunshine, because we do have multiple hazards that pose a threat to us in our day-to-day lives and activities. The Caribbean is what is considered a moderate earthquake zone. And by moderate, in the scheme of earthquake classification, it means that we're a region that tends to get magnitude 5 earthquakes regularly. And although the larger ones are not impossible, they don't happen quite as frequently as you might hear about in, say, the Pacific.
Sure,
Karleen,
Karleen, sorry.
we're
Yes,
not
you're
seeing
not.
the slides.
Not-
Yeah, could you try again? Thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay, just a moment.
Yes.
Let me go. Where is my share? Let's start again. Share sound. Do I need to check any of those?
And while Karleen brings up her slides, right, I would like to remind you, we will have a segment for question and answers at the end. So get those questions together, we will collect and we will try to answer as many as possible.
Okay, so we're seeing that now. Good to go.
Okay, you can see and you can still hear me.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, let's start again. Right, so I mentioned that we're a region that, although we have a lot of beauty around us and it seems quite endearing, you know, we do have dangerous hazards that can affect us. And today we're going to talk about earthquakes, and the Caribbean is considered to be a moderate earthquake zone. And in the scheme of earthquake classification, that would be a magnitude 5 earthquake. So it means that we would get magnitude 5 earthquakes on a regular basis, if not every year, as opposed to, say, higher magnitudes. But it doesn't mean that we won't get the higher magnitudes. Of course, many of us, until, say, recently, would not have ever felt an earthquake while we were growing up because they are so infrequent. And when they do occur, the magnitudes are quite small, say 3 and below. And so they're not easily perceived, especially if we're going about our daily life. But this doesn't mean that we should be complacent with regard to this risk and expose ourselves unnecessarily. So in the Caribbean, we face a lot of hazards. We can have hurricanes, droughts, floods, volcanoes, tsunamis, and of course, earthquakes, which is our focus today. And while we're looking at a few slides to give you some insight into what our actual risk is, I want you to consider what is our exposure and are we really at risk? And are we, meaning you, prepared? Because the communications, the ITC sector is very important in our daily lives. You know, internet, you name it, we need to be connected. Also, I want you to remember 3 things as we go through: that earthquakes do not occur randomly. They mostly occur at tectonic plate boundaries. And the tectonic plates are, of course, fragments of the crust that are broken and therefore are moving against each other because the Earth is more or less a sphere, and so they cannot move off into infinity. At some point, they will collide or move apart or simply slide past each other. And each of these movements present earthquakes, albeit with a different set of hazards. The cluster of earthquakes actually was used by scientists in the early 20th century to actually determine the actual definition or delineation of the tectonic plates that we know about globally. And of course, earthquakes can trigger other hazards. So while you think about your preparedness for earthquake, I want you to also think about have you actually prepared for some of these other secondary hazards that can be triggered, such as tsunamis, fire, liquefaction, and landslide? So let's take a closer look at the tectonics, and that is what we call the global movements in our crust. So I mentioned before that scientists were able to tell where the plate boundaries were by looking at how the earthquakes clustered. And as we look at this slide, we see that there is a rectangular shape to the lower right quadrant, and that is pretty much covering the Caribbean. And all these dots that we see are earthquakes, regardless of the color. The color simply says what depth the earthquake occurred at, whether it's a shallow earthquake or a deep earthquake, but they're all earthquakes. And we can see quite clearly, let me just get my laser pen going. You can see quite clearly here that this is a very clear indication that the Caribbean basin is in fact a plate. So we are part of a plate boundary. So what does this mean for us? In terms of the plate boundaries, to the north, we have what is called the North American plate. And of course, before we go further, I should say that the Caribbean plate is in fact stationary. It does not have any divergent type boundaries where you have magma coming up in the seafloor to push it in any particular direction. However, the North American plate and the South American plate, as you see, which bounds us to the south, are actually coming from the mid-Atlantic ridge. So it's seafloor that is being pushed westward from the mid-Atlantic ridge that is meeting the Caribbean plate and going around it. And of course, on the western edge, we have Central America, and there in the Pacific, the Caribbean plate is bound by the Cocos plate and the Nazca plate. This gives you a better view. And in the lower left quadrant, you can see a jagged line here. That's the plate boundary of the Cocos plate with the Nazca plate, which is to the right. And then we have South America. And you also see that there is a 2 centimeter per year below a red arrow, and that is giving the vector direction and speed, albeit relative, that the Caribbean plate is moving in an eastward manner. So because the North American plate and the South American plates are moving westward, the Caribbean plate seems to be moving eastward, but it's, as I said before, stationary. So everything is relative. Just one little point to highlight here, that a lot of the volcanism that we have in the Lesser Antilles is also because of this collision of Caribbean plate with the North American and South American plate. And what's happening is that the seafloor coming from the mid-Atlantic ridge is actually being subducted or diving into the magma, into the mantle, I should say, beneath the Caribbean plate. And because of this action, the upper minerals in the upper crust, as they go down, they tend to melt at a lower temperature and pressure than the actual magma from the mantle. And that is what comes back up as volcanoes. And this explains why we have volcanic volcanoes for the Lesser Antilles island arc, as well as volcanoes along Central America. And the triangles that you're seeing is an approximation of where all these volcanoes are. So that's another risk that you have to think about, but that's not what we're focused on today. So if we look closer at this figure of the tectonic plates, you see that the dashed lines, dashed red lines, these are what demark the outline of the Caribbean plate. And you will notice that in the north, there is something strange happening. It's broken off into another small sliver that passes through Jamaica and Haiti, and then it seems to disappear. And this is because of what is called the Cayman Spreading Center. So here, as you can see my pointer, this is what we call it, the Cayman Ridge. And it's very similar to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And here, new seafloor is being created, and it's being pushed both eastward and westward. And that, in fact, is what created the Cayman Trough. But of course, as you see here, there's a bit of a bottleneck. So the seafloor has nowhere to go. And so that too contributes to tectonic movements and the slivering off of a small piece of the Caribbean plate to give you a microplate called the Gonaïves microplate. And the southern boundary of this plate is what passes through Jamaica and extends into Haiti. Okay. All right. So if we start with the Eastern Caribbean, I'm not going to go through all the major earthquakes. This table simply highlights a few of the more interesting ones. We see, and our main focus would be on the magnitudes and the type of destruction. And of course, you will notice that we have magnitude 8 earthquakes along the Lesser Antilles, as well as some magnitude 6 earthquakes. And along with total destruction, there would be other effects, such as I mentioned before, tsunami and so forth. Okay, so if we look at this map, which I referenced from the Seismic Research Center in Trinidad, because they have jurisdiction for that part of the Caribbean, we see a lot of stars on the map of varying colors. And these stars are looking at the epicenters for historical earthquakes from the 1500s to the 1900s. And I just want to highlight to you that the green from this slide is indicating shallow earthquakes. And in fact, very shallow earthquakes, because in the scheme of things, shallow can go as far as 70 kilometers. And then we have from 70 kilometers, which depth, which is the blue. Purple would be 100 kilometers, 150, red would be 150 kilometers. So it's mostly shallow and intermediate depth earthquakes that you're seeing here. So everything below 70 kilometers is what you call intermediate, and everything above would be considered shallow. And we noticed that for the larger stars, which would be the magnitude 8 earthquakes, the very shallow ones, we have not had any since the 18th and 19th centuries. So here in the north, we would have had a magnitude 8 or higher earthquake, which would have been shallow, and that would have caused quite a lot of damage for the surrounding islands. Although, of course, it would have been felt in the entire region. And then to highlight further, there is another earthquake here for 1766, which would have affected the southern portion of the Lesser Antilles and more so Trinidad, to cause quite a bit of destruction. In more recent times, so from 1900s to the 2000s, we see here from this diagram that the shallow earthquakes, so everything above 70, they're all very small stars, so there's nothing here above magnitude 6, which means that the region for hundreds of years now has not had any real dangerous earthquakes. Because the thing about earthquakes is that the deeper it is, regardless of the magnitude, the less damage it is going to cause. So if you have a magnitude 7 earthquake at say 15 kilometers depth in a particular area or close to a particular set of islands, that earthquake is going to cause more damage, more destruction than say a similar magnitude earthquake with the same epicenter, the exact same epicenter, at say a depth of 70 kilometers or even 100 kilometers. The damage extent is going to be much less because as the earthquake waves move upward through the rocks, their strength is going to be dampened by the rocks themselves. So the more shallow the earthquake, the more dangerous it is. Also, some key points from the Scientific Research Center in Trinidad, looking at the number of earthquakes that the Lesser Antilles or the Eastern Caribbean would have. You see that, like I mentioned, we're a moderate earthquake zone, so you get magnitude 5 earthquakes quite regularly, and we see here that you get about 3 on average. This doesn't mean that every year you're going to get 3. Some years you may get more than 3, other years less, or perhaps even none. But on average, you get, in the Lesser Antilles, 3 magnitude 5 earthquakes per year. A magnitude 6 earthquake, perhaps every 3 to 5 years. And you notice that as the magnitudes increase, the duration between such magnitude earthquakes also increases. So for magnitude 7 earthquakes, you're looking at 20 to 30 years. And for magnitude 8 earthquakes, perhaps every 100 years or so. But as we saw from the previous map, it has been more than 200 years, if not more than 300 years, and there have not been any such devastating magnitude earthquake to have occurred. This here for 1843 was intermediate depth, so it would have been a damaging earthquake, but the effect of it, should it occur today, would be much worse. And none of that has happened thus far in the last couple of centuries. For the Greater Antilles, which is more or less the Northern Caribbean plate, so we're talking about, of course, Cayman Islands, Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola or Dominican Republic and Haiti, as well as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Here, the plate boundary is a bit simpler. It's than what is happening for, say, the Lesser Antilles, where you have, as I mentioned earlier, subduction, where one plate is diving beneath the other. In this part of the Caribbean, we simply have the plates sliding past each other. So theoretically, we wouldn't get very large magnitude earthquakes very often, but nevertheless, we can still get the large earthquakes, as we will see as we go along. Now, this, I mentioned the Cayman Trough, and it having created what is called the Gonav microplate, and let's take a closer look at that. To the left, we can see the Cayman Ridge, as I indicated, and you will notice to the north, the northern boundary goes just past Cayman Islands, as well as Cuba, and extends into Hispaniola, somewhere close to the Haiti-Dominican Republic border. To the south, we have it extending further towards Honduras, and then it comes all the way to Jamaica, and it does what is not very clear, although we see three fault lines, horizontal lines here across the island. It's not clear if these are all the movements that are occurring and, you know, where the movements are occurring the most. And then it exits from eastern Jamaica into Haiti. So this is the Gonav microplate. And if we look to the figure to the right, you'll notice that we have an area of Jamaica. All of Jamaica is covered in earthquakes, but a particular area in the east has a considerable number of earthquakes, far more so than the rest of the islands. And this is the Blue Mountains, and it's believed that the Blue Mountains are still growing, and it's because of the movement coming from the Cayman Ridge. This new sea floor, once it gets to this area here, between Haiti and Cuba, there is a bit of a bottleneck and it has nowhere to go. And so you find that there is mountain building both in Jamaica as well as in Hispaniola. Similarly, the Dominican Republic side of Hispaniola also has some of these plates and, microplates. And so that also increases the level of seismicity. So even though Hispaniola is one island, you find that there is more seismicity on the Dominican Republic section of the island than in Haiti. And it's again because of multiple microplates developing in this area, as well as in the Puerto Rico area. And another feature of this area is that as the plate boundary moves eastward to the Lesser Antilles, it starts to dive beneath the Caribbean plate, but it's not a pure vertical motion. It's what we call an oblique slip. So it's moving sort of diagonally. And because of that transition, we have what we now call the Puerto Rico Trench. And this trench is quite unusual. It's a bit of an overachiever because for its small size compared to many of the bigger trenches in, say, the Pacific, such as the Marianas, which is, you know, thousands of kilometers long, this trench is only a few miles long or a few kilometers long, and yet it is more than 8 kilometers deep, and it's actually considered to the latest readings that I've done, research I've done, it is actually considered to be the second deepest trench in the world after the Marianas Trench, which is about 11 kilometers long, deep. So for a small trench on a small little Caribbean plate, it is very unusual. And of course, along with this peculiarity is what is considered a gravity anomaly, which means that the pulling force for the North American plate that is being subducted below the Caribbean plate at this point is extremely high, much more so than for other parts of the world. So the gravity seems to be much more than what it should be. And of course, since it's a trench and it's so deep, it does have tsunami potential. So let's look at a few historical earthquakes in a more visual way, as in a map. And I'll just highlight a few of the interesting, although they're all interesting earthquakes. But if we start with, say, Puerto Rico, let me find my laser pointer. Okay, so if we start with Puerto Rico, we see here that in 1918, there was an earthquake considered to be about 7.3, because I say considered to be because in the early 20th century, there were instruments, but not all the islands were able to have seismic networks and, do good, proper recordings of these earthquakes to get a proper magnitude. And this particular earthquake, albeit not on the island of Puerto Rico itself, but in the sea, it not only caused a lot of damage, would have been about $4 million damage in 1918 dollars. It also triggered a tsunami in the trench, which was due to a submarine slide. So the sediments coming off the islands, both Puerto Rico and perhaps also from the Dominican Republic, the sediments going into the trench are on a very steep slope. And just like a hillside slope that is steep and unstable, you can have mass movement or land slippage, what we call a submarine slide. And that displacement of sediments would in turn displace water in the trench and trigger a tsunami. And they had a tsunami. The highest the highest height for that tsunami was over 3.5 meters. So even though it was not the plate boundary itself that moved in the sea and triggered the tsunami, you can still trigger tsunamis if the island shelf, which is that bit of the island that gradually goes off into the sea, if that is quite steep, then a strong earthquake, magnitude 7, perhaps even a high 6, magnitude 6 earthquake can trigger a tsunami by causing a submarine slide. And on that note, we can go over to Jamaica, and we see here 1692, and that's approximated to be a 7.5 earthquake based on the damage pattern and some of the other features that occurred, which included liquefaction. So the soil, this is the earthquake that totally destroyed Port Royal, which was dubbed the wickedest city. and totally swallowed up all its riches, because this area is mostly sandspit that joins a few keys to the mainland of Jamaica. And so during that shaking, there was liquefaction because the water table is high and the soil is very sandy and loose. And the shaking increased the pore pressure of the water, forced the grains apart, and so the soil started to behave like quicksand, and structures and people or whatever that has a weight that will be on this portion of the island, they would not be able to be supported by this land, which is now quite slushy, and they would start to sink, and that is pretty much what happened. And in addition to that, there was notes about ships being thrown towards the land, which would indicate a tsunami. And so you had quicksand and tsunami, and of course in the mountains you would have had landslides. So there are multiple hazards that can come from an earthquake. And so whatever territory you have your assets in, not because it's all Caribbean, you should not assume that the type of damage that any particular magnitude earthquake can cause is going to be exactly the same. You have to really look at the siting of your assets, whether they're at the coast or in the mountains. If it's at the coast, perhaps you're susceptible to liquefaction, as well as submarine landslides, which can cut or sever communication cables, as well as wash away other assets that you may have at the coast, including your stores and corporate offices, that sort of thing. So how you build will be also very important if you have assets in these areas. In mountainous areas, again, you have to think about landslides. And then we come to Haiti. And here we see the 2010 earthquake that caused so much devastation. It rendered more than 1 million people homeless, and it's estimated that some 200,000 persons would have lost their lives. And it totally wiped out the GDP for the country that year. And so here we see that they had this devastating earthquake, and prior to that earthquake, the largest magnitude earthquake of this kind would have been a 7.5 earthquake in 1770. So what this is telling us is that, yes, we're a moderate zone. We mostly get magnitude 5 earthquakes or less, but we can have the very big earthquakes. And so we shouldn't have a sense of complacency in thinking that it's never going to happen because it hasn't happened in the last 100 years or the last 200 years. At some point, it will happen because earthquakes do have a cycle. It's just that as scientists, the science of seismology has not evolved sufficiently for us to be able to accurately predict these cycles, as well as predict exactly when such an earthquake, meaning date and time, is going to occur. And I will leave it at that. You can see that there are many, many destructive earthquakes, even in Cuba region, going far back into the 18th century and possibly beyond. So let's take a closer look at what I mentioned before about Dominican Republic having its own sets of microplates. And you can see some of it here. It looks very fragmented, all these lines, both offshore as well as cutting through the island, coming into the Caribbean Sea, and so forth. So a similar thing, this is where the Gonave microplate would have ended, but you can see that other faults are creating other microplates in this region. And something to note about the 2010 earthquake that destroyed Haiti is that it was not on the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault, which is the southern boundary of the Gonave microplate. It wasn't on that fault. It was actually on what you call a splay. So when we think of plate boundaries, we tend to think about a straight line, but quite often the boundary is actually a zone. So it covers a wide area. And so these are smaller faults that would extend off from the main fault and also be capable, depending on their length, of creating quite large earthquakes, magnitude 7 and above. So in terms of Haiti, the research that would have been done to suggest that since 1770, there hasn't been a big earthquake along this fault. So, you know, perhaps the 2010, at the time this paper was done, they would have thought that it was on this fault, but further studies showed that they were wrong. So Haiti is still capable of getting a magnitude 7+ earthquake on this fault at any time. In terms of looking a little closer at Jamaica, what I want to highlight here is that because an earthquake happens close by, depending on what the rock type and structure of the sea floor or the island is, doesn't necessarily mean that an earthquake close to one island will automatically destroy a neighboring island. And here we're looking at a magnitude 7.7 earthquake that occurred just between the Cayman Islands and Cuba. So this is the northern boundary of the Gonave microplate. And this was quite close to that boundary, so it's considered to be an earthquake on that boundary. And this 7.7, you will also notice that there are little lines of different colors encapsulating areas on the map. This is what we call a seismicity map. And the orange would indicate, the innermost color would indicate the strongest shaking. And here we see on our table the intensity. And you will see that, okay, very close to the epicenter, they had an intensity of, say, 8. But in short order, by the time the earthquake waves got to Cayman Islands, it had dropped to intensity 6, which would put the earthquake, you know, so even the 7.7 here, by the time it got here, the shaking would not be that of a 7.7 earthquake, because that is what the intensity is about. The magnitude remains the same, but as you go further away from the epicenter, the amount of shaking and other phenomena that you would associate with an earthquake will be reduced. And by the time it got to eastern Jamaica, it was barely perceptible. Haiti would have hardly felt it unless you were favorable position, because by the time you get to intensities that are in the blue and the blue-green color, the equivalent magnitude would be 3 or less. And so you wouldn't be having any, even though it's magnitude 7.7, you won't have any damage for these areas or any significant damage. Perhaps depending on how old the structure is or how well built a structure is, perhaps Western Jamaica might have had some minor damages, But again, that would be based on age of structure, because with modern technology, how things are built with mortar and steel, and we have rigid building codes, such an earthquake should not cause any damage. So we look again, we had a similar phenomenon a little further along last year, November, and it was a Sunday morning, and it was a foreshock of 5.6, I think, 5.9. I'm looking here. And the main earthquake was 6.8. This is a map that you can view from the US Geological Survey. It's freely available online. And then you see that there is some aftershock activity. And further on the 8th of March, there was a 7.6 earthquake further along this fault line, going closer to Honduras. And that too didn't cause any damage either to Cayman Islands, Cuba, or Jamaica. There was a tsunami warning, but of course, that was canceled after an hour or so, because when you have faults that are simply sliding past each other, there tends not to be any significant disturbance of the water column. And if you don't have a significant disturbance, which, like I said, could be caused by, say, a submarine slide, you're not going to get a tsunami. And so what I want us to take away as we go into the discussion segment is to realize that all the islands of the Caribbean basin, so from Cuba coming around along the Greater Antilles to Lesser Antilles, Trinidad, ABC Islands, we're all subject to earthquakes because we are all located on the plate boundary. And the plate boundary is where earthquakes occur. There are very few earthquakes that occur in the middle of the Caribbean basin itself, because there's not much plate activity going on there. And so this means that the entire region is always at risk for earthquakes. As I showed before, major earthquakes in the Eastern Caribbean can and usually does affect the neighboring islands. But in the north, this is not necessarily so, because a major earthquake, as we just saw off the coast of Cuba, has very little effect in Jamaica or in Haiti. But on the other hand, if you have a major earthquake in Puerto Rico, it would be strongly felt in the Dominican Republic as well as the Virgin Islands. And so they too could have damage. And if there is another event that generated a tsunami, then they too would also be at risk for a localized tsunami. So tsunamis are a possibility. And for all the earthquake activity that I've shown you since the 17th century, there has not been any record of a tectonic tsunami of the actual plate boundary between Lesser Antilles and the North American plate or South American plate actually moving to displace a large column of water to cause a mega tsunami. So even though that has not happened for the hundreds of years that Columbus has discovered and we have all been here, it doesn't mean that it won't happen. But unfortunately, we just haven't been around long enough to know what that cycle is The latest scientific paper I saw just a few weeks ago would suggest that perhaps this cycle is a 2,000-year cycle, but it still remains to be seen where in the cycle we are. So as you do your planning and as you take your precautions, you really also need, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, to plan carefully for the event of a tsunami, because your marine cables, your communication cables are all going to be at risk, as well as structures that are along the coast. And so as we go forward, yes, we have the earthquake, we are vulnerable to earthquakes, but these, I believe, that we can mitigate against and have sustainable development if we are able to develop a culture of safety, a culture of earthquake safety. So I hope that I have given you a better understanding of the risk, and therefore, as you go forward with your plans and your business development, that you can keep this risk in mind and make the entire region a safer place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karleen. I don't think we can thank you enough for that conversation. Very insightful. I don't think I saw it as much with the amount of details in a long while. You mentioned one of the 3 things to remember that you touched on, and that it would trigger other hazards. And that's you brought it up in the latter part of your conversation, but in my mind, there was a 7.6 magnitude, I think, about 6 weeks ago, early February, and it triggered that tsunami watch for about 6 different islands. And while there was a sense of fear, I must say the SIDEMA, a lot of hands went on deck to guide us on what to do. So it's something that we also have to put in our planning, not just focus on the drop, cover, hold on. And a very nice video to start this session as well. So let us practice the planning, the what to do. We can't plan when it will happen, but we can prepare that when it happens, we're ready. It's important that not only for businesses, but for personal, we have a business continuity plan. The family must know what to do when they're at home, steps, that culture of safety. So thank you so much, Karleen. I'm going to open the floor for questions. I know I saw one in the chat earlier from Fatima. Okay. Is that a seismic gap south of Grenada? There was a map that you showed earlier, Karleen, and the question was asking if there's a gap south of Grenada.
I would say there are gaps for the entire region, because all the earthquakes that I showed, let me see if I can get back to it.
Gail says, awesome presentation while you look for that. Yes.
Okay. All the earthquakes that I showed on those 2 maps for the region were, the major ones were all intermediate earthquakes. And so because when the plates are subducting, what you're seeing is just major earthquakes here coming from portions of the plate that have already gone 70 or more kilometers down.
Okay.
Those are the major earthquakes you're seeing. You're seeing very small earthquakes for movement to the surface, but at some point that small movement from the surface needs to catch up with what is happening below. And so at some point you are going to get that region will get a big earthquake or a series of big earthquakes, because it's quite a large boundary.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Karleen. Okay. We want to know tell us the importance of building codes. You know, right across, we see a lot of infrastructure going in. How important is this?
Well, the building code is crucial. It is vital to our survival, where earthquakes and other hazards are concerned, really, because that is what is going to tell us if you're building on a particular type of building. It will tell you the standards that the materials should be at. It will tell you how to do your foundation, you know, what considerations the engineers will have to take into to have to bear in mind in their designs if they're building multiple story buildings as opposed to a single story building. So it's very crucial. It covers materials as well as design.
Okay. And you would notice that, especially with the earthquake in Haiti, 2010, right?
Right.
A lot of the buildings collapsed, and part of the blame was poor infrastructure. So again,
Yes.
it's a
The
conversation
majority of
that
the
we need to
blame
have.
was for infrastructure.
Yes. All right. I want to jump to a quick one, right? Technology has improved, but way back in the days, how did we measure? Centuries ago, how did we measure earthquakes? What was the tool used to measure?
Well, you would only know that an earthquake occurred, but in the early days, you would only know perhaps what direction it came from, and you'd feel an earthquake and you would just attribute whatever you felt to your island. Let's say we're talking about Caribbean, you attribute it to your island, when, as we saw earlier, it could be something coming from Cuba. It's just that it was big enough for us to feel it. So you may sometimes get a sense of what direction it's coming from, but you couldn't really tell the magnitude. As instrumentation improved, scientists were able to go back to these historical records, these newspaper and diary entries, and look at the types of damage or, you know, any natural phenomenon that persons would describe, and they would compare it with what's happening for different magnitude earthquakes today. And with that, they're then able to put together what they call an intensity scale. So the intensity scale is really a gauge or an estimate as to how strong an earthquake is based on what is observed and felt. So that's how they measure it.
Okay. All right. We want a tip from you, right? What's one advice that you would give to communities and business to improve preparedness based on your experience? Just what's your top advice?
Well, I would say to not ignore it, because a lot of persons here in Jamaica, you know, when the Haiti earthquake happened, oh, they said, oh, you know, maybe the people were wicked because they practiced voodoo, and, you know, God, we are Christians, so God will help us. But, and then there are others who don't even want to talk about it because they're so scared of it. So that is the biggest hurdle we have here in Jamaica. You know, the audience from other territories can tell us what their experiences are, but that is the biggest challenge here in Jamaica, just to get people to accept that we're an earthquake country and really pay attention to what they need to do. Because it's not the earthquakes that kill us, it's the structures that we build and the things we put in these structures, because you can have an earthquake resilient building that stands up to a magnitude 9 earthquake, but you have some nice paintings hanging over your sofa, or a nice urn, or something of the sort, any heavy object that's gonna fall on you during the earthquake, and that's the end of you. And the house or the office building is still standing.
On that point, someone asked the question as well. What if you're not in a secure building? Does the drop, cover, hold on method still work?
Yes, it does, but you have to be aware of what it's, or keep aware of what's happening. Because if you realize that the intensity of the earthquake is such that the building is starting to collapse, it may be in your interest to exit the building, albeit that it's quite dangerous to do so because things that walls and other items could be falling. But if it's certain collapse and you are not under a secure structure, such as a heavy desk or table, exiting the building might be your best option.
To an open space.
Right.
Okay. All right.
But that's a last resort.
Okay. Fair. All right. Lanika is asking, was it a landslide that triggered the Port Royal tsunami as a result of soil liquefaction?
No, the tsunami, the submarine slide would have been triggered by the shaking.
Okay. Okay.
The liquefaction would have been why the buildings and perhaps persons started to sink into the soil. So it's two different things happening.
Okay. All right. We are in 2025, right? I know some Android phones will give an alert. Is there anything that you see in the region in terms of early warning systems in the ICT space?
I'm not the best person to ask on this, but I would say it depends on the territory.
Okay.
Because if it's, say, Lesser Antilles, and you know that earthquakes can, from one island, close to one island, can affect the neighboring islands. And if you did have an alerting system, the island closest to the earthquake epicenter would not benefit from the early warning, but the others would. It would give them a few seconds or even a few minutes lead time to take cover. Because really that is what happens in Japan. It's not that the early warning is going to alert everyone that, oh, an earthquake is coming. No, the earthquake occurs. Those who are closest to it are already in it. And it's those who are further away that will benefit.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Karleen. Someone said in Kingston, we're seeing an increase in high-rise buildings. How concerned should we be about potential disaster in case of earthquakes? And before you take that one, Karleen, I was at a session late last year, and this same question was posed because everywhere we go, there's a new apartment complex going up. What is it that, well, and I think that would be partial on the government as well, how we reinforce these building codes and the approval of it. We know that we also have a situation where buildings are going up, small homes, and one of the ministers did make mention that he warned someone not to build his property there. And there was a storm. It wasn't even the earthquake, it was a storm. And when he went back, that house was missing. And to this date, the person has not been found. It is a similar process when it comes down to earthquake, because we see the buildings going up. How concerned should we be though? Especially when buying into these complexes.
Well, if you're buying, I would want to, see the designs and know some of the safety specifications for the building, because it's very important that there were no corners cut, that everything was done by the book. Because the thing about an earthquake is that, and we see it in countries such as Turkey, it's a European country, it's supposed to be well developed, but they have a big earthquake and, some of their apartment buildings, they crumble like, Legos or cookies. And it's because unscrupulous contractors and developers, did what they shouldn't and used substandard materials or built in an area that they shouldn't have. So it's really depends on how much confidence we have in the approval process.
Okay. I'm going to say the last one. I saw a hand raised. It's not raised anymore. Okay. We're currently in an era where telecommunication network resiliency is of significant concern. Considering your expertise, do you find it reasonable to move telecoms infrastructure below ground? Would such an action make much difference?
Well, considering that we do have other hazards that we have to deal with, such as floods and hurricanes, even in countries such as Japan, they do have infrastructure below ground, but then they also have the engineering technology to ensure that these structures are very secure and are designed in such a way that if there is any disruption, that it's segmented in such a way that they can fix a section very quickly, and get things back online in short order. So I think it's up to the planning and the design of the systems. If you do it like you would a Lego, that you can remove this section and still have connection, reconnect somehow to the other portions, then yes, I think it can work.
And I'd like to chime in on that one as well, because it's a conversation that we have been discussing. And even in 2023, we had a big magnitude, anything over 5 to me, that is
Okay.
And we had a cut in our subsea fiber cable. Yes, we had redundancies in place, but it was cut. And it took us some time to get that resolved. We also looked at the situation last year, and we know this is earthquake, but with Beryl, a lot of what could have, been saved if we were underground, the areas that were underground stood up to it. And we still have factors that will affect even the underground. We have vandalism, stuff like that, but it is more secure. And I mean, it's a big investment, but I guess if we wait out, it should be something that we are considering going into the next phase.
Yes, and
yeah,
I agree with you. And to add to that, what happened with Beryl, an earthquake could do the same. It can bring down utility poles and disrupt service in a similar manner. In terms of, you probably wouldn't get as much flooding immediately, but it can cause landslides that could dam rivers. And when these dams break suddenly, you get the flooding afterwards. So, it's not a bad idea to go subsurface.
Karleen, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you for an enlightening presentation and conversation. I think we're over the time and no one has dropped, which means that we did not bore them, right? I'm gonna say thanks before I go and hand over to our CANTO team. Thank you so much for being with us today, guys. I'm gonna hand you over to Teresa Wankin, who is our Secretary General for CANTO.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Karleen, and thank you, Kanisha, and the entire BCM Committee of CANTO for putting on this CANTO conversation together for us, Earthquake Hazard and the Caribbean. These insights are very invaluable. I learned so many things from this presentation, Karleen. So I really want to say again, on behalf of CANTO, the association, a big thank you. Thank you also to our audience for your thoughtful and engaging questions. But before we wrap up, I have a couple of important announcements to share. First, we're excited to invite you to our next CANTO conversation scheduled for the 24th of April. And this session will be featuring Cloud Carib as we take a deep dive into cloud services in Latin America and the Caribbean. Invitations should go out shortly. I encourage you all to register and continue to stay connected with us as we continue to speak and have very informal conversations on the matters that impact us in the Caribbean region. Next, be sure to mark your calendars for CANTO's 40th Annual Conference and Trade Exhibition. And this will take place from the 13th to the 16th of July 2025 at the Grand Hyatt in the Bahamas. This, as you know, is a premier platform for all ICT stakeholders. So do not miss this opportunity to join the conversation, showcase your brand, or just meet the right people to grow your business. So again, on behalf of me and my team, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks and gratitude to Ms. Karleen Black, Ms. Kenisha Plunkett-Brown, and the CANTO Business Continuity Committee, the Vice Chair Lee Singh, the Coordinator Devika Fleming, for this engaging and highly informative conversation. Thank you. Stay connected with CANTO.
Thank you, everyone. It was great being here.
Thank you.